Okay, this is last semester I did a video, a YouTube, that was entitled "The Civil Rights Movement Part 1." And I think it brought us up to 1954, the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus the Board of Ed, which made segregation in education unconstitutional, and sort of by precedent, it kind of eliminates all segregation. Not that it happened immediately, but it signals a change in American history. Up to that point, you had 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson that claimed if you could have separate facilities for blacks and whites as long as they were equal, but they were seldom equal, so that was kind of a problem. But that's the basis for separate water fountains, separate bathrooms, etc., etc. Okay? This is going to be the Civil Rights Movement Part 2 that I promised last semester and didn't deliver. I believe the instructions for the second paper are in the course content, and it deals with the Civil Rights Movement. And, you know, right now, I'm thinking that the Civil Rights Movement is very, very important in sort of modern American history, recent American history, my lifetime history. Just yesterday we had this verdict come down in the George Floyd case, and it's kind of unusual for a police officer to be charged and to be found guilty of these kinds of actions, these kinds of crimes. Now I went on the internet and found this right away. The Civil Rights Movement timeline, 1954 to 1968. I guess 68 is a good place to stop, but it's not. It's not like things magically got better. 1968 is when Martin Luther King gets assassinated, and there are riots all across the country. So it's not a point at which things are finished. Race relations are sort of finished, but it helps. So in the first part, I talked about Jackie Robinson putting the issue of segregation in Major League Baseball on the agenda. 1948, there is Truman has an executive order that integrates the armed forces, and that's very smooth. That goes very smoothly. Also in 1948, the Democratic Party puts a civil rights plank in its platform. And that's kind of esoteric language. It means that when they made up the party platform at their convention, they voted to put in a plank, an issue about civil rights, and that caused the breakaway of a bunch of Southern Democrats who formed their a third party. It was actually a fourth party in 1948, but that's not important. They formed a party. I forget what the party's actual name is, but everybody calls it the Dixiecrats. And they ran Strom Thurmond from, I think, South Carolina as their presidential nominee. For a third party, they did pretty well. They got a bunch of electoral votes in the South. And what it indicated was that the Democratic Party had a problem. The Northern Liberal part of the Democratic Party, the FDR part, the New Deal part, wanted to move on civil rights. The old-time Southern white Democratic Party in the South did not. So that can be a problem. Truman gets reelected in 1948 by the skin of his teeth. There's a famous photo of him holding up a newspaper that declares that Thomas Dewey won the election, but actually Truman won the election. That brings us to the Brown versus the Board of Ed. The Supreme Court rules that separate but equal is unconstitutional. It's inherently unconstitutional. To separate out one group of people is unequal. Pretty logical. But that doesn't mean anything happens. The Supreme Court doesn't have any ability to enforce its rulings. It has to rely on the executive branch to actually enforce these things. And the next year they will pass they will have a second ruling, which sort of sets up a schedule for integration. But there's massive resistance to this in the South. Okay. 1955 is the Montgomery bus boycott. I believe they teach Rosa Parks pretty thoroughly in middle school and high school. What they sometimes don't teach is that she wasn't just a seamstress on the bus going home who was fed up. She was the secretary of the local branch of the NAACP, and the incident may have been planned. She may have been chosen or volunteered to be the person to get arrested by not giving up her seat to a white man on the bus. That leads to the bus boycott, and this is boycotts are a great tactic because you can't force people to ride the bus. And what happens is for about 18 months, black people in Montgomery, Alabama, refuse to take public transportation. Well, it's not public transportation. They refuse to ride the buses. They're privately owned companies. And so they're walking to work, they're carpooling to work, all that kind of, it's a whole community affair. And it starts to hurt the downtown merchants, the white downtown merchants, because people, they begin shopping in their own neighborhoods and stuff like that. It takes a long time. 18 months is a long time, but they win in the end. They get the city of Montgomery removes those ordinances about segregation, and people are able to ride the buses wherever they want to sit. Okay. The next thing on this timeline is the campaign of massive resistance to school desegregation. This is, if any of you have seen Forrest Gump, I realize now, I was thinking about it yesterday, that it's like 2 generations ago, Forrest Gump. I don't know if if any of you have seen it, but there's a scene in that movie where George Wallace is the governor of Alabama, and he's blocking black students from entering the University of Alabama. And this is happening all over the South. You can Google Ruby Bridges. I think she's in New Orleans. She's a little 6-year-old girl. She's still alive. I saw her on TV recently. Going into school, escorted by federal marshals to protect her from the angry crowds of white people. There were some really frightening pictures of the Little Rock Central High School. 9 black kids that were going into Central High School in Little Rock. And they're just surrounded by these hateful crowds of white people. There's one woman that she haunts my dreams in one of these pictures. And she's screaming. You can almost see what she's screaming at the young woman who's going in. All right. So not only the parents of white students, but the governor and other people in the southern states were pledging massive resistance to integrating the schools, making it very difficult. And this is going. I don't know that we have like real integration of schools even today, because for the most part, public schools take students from residential areas, and we still have a lot of segregation in residential housing. So that a high school in a black neighborhood is all black, and a high school in a white neighborhood is all white or mostly white, and it's still kind of a problem. But it's not in the law, and it's not considered constitutional anymore. And that's another thing. Eisenhower and then I think Kennedy have to call in troops to protect these black students on their way into the now integrated schools. Okay. They mention here one of the things on the timeline is Martin Luther King Jr. being elected as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That is his organization, right? The Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I don't know if it's all ministers, but there are a lot of ministers involved in it, okay? And they basically, they share Martin Luther King's commitment to nonviolence, first of all, but also to civil disobedience, of not necessarily obeying rules if they think they're unjust. They will break the rules. Okay. Now, it says here 1958 was the year of sit-ins, and I don't remember that. They say it starts in 1958. I think of the sit-ins as beginning in 1960. A group of students in Greensboro, North Carolina, go into the Woolworths. There's a lunch counter in the Woolworths, and Woolworths was like a 5 and dime store. I still remember them. They were, it was a great place to go as a kid because they had like toys and stuff, and then because we were white, we could sit at the counter and you have an ice cream sundae or something like that. But the counters in Woolworths in the South were only for white people. And a group of 4 college students from a local college went in, sat down, ordered whatever they ordered, and the waitresses refused to serve them, but they wouldn't leave. And eventually, crowds of white people came in, and there was violence. They were beating these the sitter-inners. I don't know. And then it would get on television, and television is an important part of this whole civil rights movement. It would get on television, and then college students in Nashville, or Memphis, or Gainesville, or Jacksonville, or Jackson, Mississippi, college students would start showing up at Woolworths and doing the same thing with the sit-ins. And eventually it broke down. And Woolworths had to back off of its segregated policies. All right? Again, boycotts, sit-ins, these are sort of direct actions that don't involve violence on the part of the black people. It's mainly passive resistance that the black people suffer through. Now, some other things, some other important things, and you can look any of these up. There are other timelines on available on the internet, and there's probably little documentaries on YouTube. In 1961, groups of blacks and whites from the North would take Greyhound buses and other long distance buses, trailways, whatever, into the South. And in the South, there were segregated waiting rooms, segregated sections on the buses. Everything was segregated. But in 1961, they were attempting to integrate those bus lines. They faced a tremendous amount of violence. Let's see. One bus was firebombed. One group of riders was attacked by the Ku Klux Klan, and many by mobs in the cities they traveled to. On May 24th, 300 riders to Jackson, Mississippi were arrested and put in jail, merely for being on a bus and being black next to a white person or a white person next to a black person. Okay. Now, 1963 is the March on Washington, and the background for this is that Kennedy is still president. The March on Washington is in late August. He won't be assassinated until November. And he knows he has to do something on civil rights. But he's afraid of alienating that part of the Democratic Party that is the segregationist Southerners. So he's kind of in a bit of a bind. And one reason for the March on Washington was to support Kennedy in, show him some support for these measures, these civil rights measures. Okay. I'm sure you've all heard part of the "I Have a Dream" speech, which I think I've read quite a few speeches in American history, and I think this is the best one. The Gettysburg Address is pretty fine, and there's a guy named Eugene Debs that gives a speech at Canton, Ohio during World War I. That's a pretty good speech, and Frederick Douglass has some good speeches. But "I Have a Dream" is just way up there, okay? And if you read the whole thing, it's stirring, He's saying that, there were promises made in the Declaration of Independence. He actually says he uses the term promissory note. When you borrow something from somebody, you sign a promissory note. And he's basically saying that the U.S. has borrowed stuff from African Americans, and it's time to pay it back, basically. I have a personal. The speech was given on a Saturday in late August. My birthday is September 1st, so it was right before my birthday. August Saturday, a summer Saturday. It's almost school time. I was out playing. I came in to get a drink of water, and my mother had the speech on the radio. She was doing something in the kitchen with the shelving, and I remember thinking, wait, what is she listening to? Because normally it would be music and news reports and that kind of thing, and it was a black voice giving a speech, and I was like, no, that's odd, but I didn't know what the hell was going on, so I just had my got my water, and went back out to play. So it was the Martin Luther King speech. And similarly, I don't know if it was before or after the march. There's a thing in Birmingham, Alabama, where people were trying to, integrate facilities and stuff like that. And the police responded with hoses, fire hoses, dogs, and clubs. And most of the people that were getting hosed and clubbed were like teenagers or maybe young 20s, And when I saw it on the news that night, I said to my father, what did they do, Because it seemed to me that the response was just outrageous. That they must have bombed something or been looting. And he said, I think they were demonstrating for their civil rights, which is pretty much the truth. You could be hosed just for that. They mentioned the letter from Birmingham jail. That's an important document. Sorry. This is important because what happens in the course of the 60s, and sometimes, one of the points I'd like to make in my history classes, and I do a better job of it if I'm in class, is that, and this was the point of the first discussion, these different things go on at the same time, okay? And yet when we learn history, we take all the civil rights stuff and put it in a timeline. And then maybe over here there's another timeline for the economy or workers' struggles or union struggles. And maybe there's a third one for the Vietnam War. But they're all happening at the same time, okay? And what's happening by the 60s, by 63, 64, Britain and France can no longer sustain their imperialist, their colonies in Africa. And so African countries are getting their independence, or they're pushing for their independence. Sometimes it's a violent struggle, sometimes it's a less violent struggle, or just an independence movement, okay? But that has effects on what's going on in the United States. There are lots of African Americans who begin to look at struggles in Africa as being part of their struggle, and their struggle is part of what's going on in Africa. And out of this eventually is going to grow a Black Power movement that is very important, okay? They talk about Malcolm X, who in 1964, he formally advocates self-defense and black nationalism. I think they spelled formally wrong there. But anyway, Malcolm X arises in an atmosphere where Martin Luther King is the leading civil rights guy. And he's all about passive resistance and nonviolence. And Malcolm X comes along and says, no, we'll defend ourselves. If you attack us, we'll fight back. And he has famous quotes, by any means necessary. And he's a guy that was a burglar. He was into drugs and pimping and these other things. And then he gets sent to jail, and he converts to the Nation of Islam, which is a branch of Islam that's not completely orthodox, but it does teach that, it kind of teaches that black people are worthwhile that African civilizations are worthwhile, that that all the kind of propaganda about blacks being less than human or dumb or lazy or blah, 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 blah. It teaches the opposite of that. Okay, and that's important because part of how you keep an oppressed people oppressed is to convince them that they don't deserve to not be oppressed, and people start pointing out, well, Egyptians were Africans and had this great civilization, and there are cities all along the west coast of Africa and stuff like that. It becomes an important thing to know. In 1964, you get the first Civil Rights Act. It eliminates legalized racial segregation in the United States. It made it illegal to discriminate against blacks or other minorities in hiring, public accommodations, education, or transportation. Now, this should have been against the law from Reconstruction days, but it wasn't, or it was, and then it was undermined, and you had to redo it. Okay. But again, that's a change in the law, and then it has to filter down to all of the various cities and villages and towns. Okay, there's a couple of rock and roll plays a role in this. There's a couple of movies. I know Ray is one of them, and maybe the James Brown movie. I forget what it's called. When these guys started to attract a white audience, they would give shows like Ray Charles. They would give shows, and in the South they have to separate the audiences. It's absurd, but they had to separate the audiences, and people were getting arrested because they were race mixing, just dancing, not really doing anything more than that. But rock and roll does play a role in breaking down some of those. There were theaters where black people had to sit up in the balcony, and only white people could sit on the floor, and absurd stuff. In 1964, there's a riot in Harlem. It says a race riot here. Now this is something I have to try to make clear. The term race riot means different things at different times in American history. In the 1860s, 1870s, a race riot meant mobs of white people going in and attacking black people. Okay. A classic example is the Tulsa riot of 1921, where white people just destroyed a fairly prosperous area of Tulsa that was inhabited by black people. But around the same time, like in Chicago, there's a race riot, and the blacks fight back. So that's different than just an attack by whites on blacks, but that's like a race war, In the 60s, a race riot was basically an explosion of frustration in black communities that very often the anger was directed towards white store owners or chain stores that were in their neighborhood, and there was looting and burning and that kind of stuff. When the police and the fire departments would show up, they would get attacked. So it's a race riot is a different thing at different times. That's the important point. I'm going to skip over the march from Selma to Montgomery because it's kind of, I'm running out of time, and because, well, you should read about it, okay? People get attacked on the first march, and then the government backs them up, and they get support, and they get a second march that goes without interruption, without getting attacked. 1965, there's a Voting Rights Act. Okay, and this is very important. I've read that in 1960, only 3% of black people in Mississippi were eligible to vote because of the poll taxes and the literacy test, etc., etc. It was impossible, basically, to get registered to vote. Very recently, like, I don't know, 6 years ago or something like that. You probably don't think of that as recently, but the older you get, the longer recently becomes. The Supreme Court ruled that certain parts of the Voting Rights Act couldn't be enforced. And the main one was this. Certain states that had a history of discriminating in voting against black people could not make changes to their voting laws without federal approval. And the Supreme Court ruled that that wasn't fair. And since then, we've seen all these kinds of laws that are aiming at keeping black people from voting. Cutting down the number of voting places, requiring voter IDs. There's a recent law in Georgia that says you can't give out water to people online waiting to vote for hours. I don't know. But the Voting Rights Act was very important. And of course, you pass the legislation, and then other things have to happen in order for it to become a reality. But the important thing is this. With the Voting Rights Act, black people in the South are allowed to vote. And since the Democratic Party has been the single political party in the South for a very long time, and because black people are sort of drawn to the Democratic Party because that's who's passing these civil rights laws. And going back to the New Deal, African Americans are drawn to the Democratic Party. Blacks begin to vote in the Democratic Party and begin to nominate people for the Democratic Party, for these Democratic Party seats. And that becomes a problem for the serious white supremacists in the South. And that's probably the number one reason why they switched to the Republican Party. Probably by 1980, the switch is complete. They tend to vote for, they voted for Jimmy Carter in 1976, a Democrat, because they thought he was a Southerner and a born-again Christian, and they didn't realize how liberal he was. 4 years later, they voted en masse. Well, everybody voted en masse for Ronald Reagan. All right. Okay, I'm going to come down to this this point here. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Oh, I missed marking it this year on Facebook. It's the 4th of April, 1968. We know who shot him. James Earl Ray was the guy that shot him. He was arrested, I think, in England. He made his getaway pretty good. But he was clearly hired by somebody, and nobody knows who it was. There's a lot of speculation about who shot Kennedy for real, you know, but not that much speculation about who actually took out Martin Luther King. Okay, there were riots in black neighborhoods. You can imagine the frustration and the anger that would accompany an assassination like that. In more than 110 cities across the U.S. in the days that followed. And it really points up something that no matter how he's dedicated to nonviolence, dedicated to, you know, passive resistance, dedicated to doing things the right way. And still he's dangerous, and somebody decides they have to kill him. Okay? It's kind of a fact of life for black leaders and for black people. Okay? So that's the end of this timeline. But let me just say that it doesn't include the Black Panthers, which is an important part. Let me just say that by by 65, we're deeply involved in Vietnam. There's more turmoil in Africa. There's things, ideologies like Pan-Africanism, that all African people share the same interests and stuff, and that would include the descendants of Africans in the Western Hemisphere, in America, in, you know, Brazil, in Mexico, in Cuba. The concept of imperialism is being tossed around, U.S. imperialism. By 65, we're in this war in Vietnam, and the rationalization is that we can't let communists take over Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. Lots and lots of black people are drafted. Black soldiers are drafted, because they did have a draft then. You could get a deferment if you were in college, but a lot of black soldiers were not in college. A lot of poor whites were not in college either. It wasn't like today where everybody goes to college. A lot of people were drafted. You had these soldiers going over there, black soldiers whose lieutenants are calling everybody gooks, you know. Every Vietnamese person they come in contact, they're calling them gooks. And the black soldiers are thinking, well, what does he call me when I'm not around, you know? Because a guy that will use gook will use other racial epithets when he gets a chance. And the Vietnam War it's so different from the other wars. It just has a decaying effect on American culture. But anyway, many black activists, especially younger people, start thinking that, well, you know, it's all good and well to do passive resistance and nonviolence, but we're getting to the point where it's not working. Okay, and once you assassinate the leader of the movement that has those ideals, it's kind of very wide open. In 1966, there's two guys form an organization called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland, California. Huey Newton and Bobby, oh God, I can't remember his name. Anyway, the Panthers are a very interesting group. They dress in sort of military style, berets, leather jackets. They carry guns, open carry guns. There's you can find pictures of them on the steps of the state capitol in California, all holding guns, when the legislature was debating gun control. And I think that many black guys on the stairs with guns probably pushed the legislation further. But they were revolutionaries. They weren't content with just getting our fair share in this system. They thought the whole system had to be taken apart. They were kind of socialist Marxist guys, but in a sort of different way. But they did run health clinics, and they did breakfast programs, and they did education and stuff like that. And they promoted black pride. Most of them wore afros and not processed hairdos, and they were very popular in the black community. They were very popular. They were very attractive to white activists as well, and white people. I used to go into Greenwich Village. I lived in Brooklyn, and I'd go into Greenwich Village, and I'd always buy their paper. It was $0.25, I think. And just because, Oh my goodness. I sit here and I don't talk to anybody for hours and hours, and then when I try to make a video, it's like, Anyway, that's part of the Black Power movement, and it spreads from the Panthers. There's a student group attached to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. It's called SNCC, generally pronounced SNCC. There's a guy named Stokely Carmichael who will change his name to an African name. And he becomes a spokesman for this sort of Black Power approach. I watched Spike Lee's movie Black Klansman recently. And that could be like in the last, no, it was last year, I think. And that focused on Stokely Carmichael quite a bit. But almost all of this kind of fizzled out by the end of the early 70s, okay? Well, I say fizzled out, I mean the FBI launches a program to basically assassinate and disrupt the Panthers and any other groups that are sort of anti-American, okay? Fred Hampton gets assassinated. They do all these dirty tricks. Look up COINTELPRO, okay? It'll tell you all about that. 1970, the student movement gets a shock when the National Guard at Kent State shoots 4 students who were demonstrating against the war in Vietnam. Well, they shoot 4 students, and there were students demonstrating against the war in Vietnam, but not all of them. Some of the 4 were just on their way to class, and now they're dead. That put a kind of break on the student movement, okay? And you have all this stuff. You have Nixon starts to do, he's doing his Watergate. He gets busted for Watergate, and then there's hearings, and he's forced to resign. Ford becomes president, although nobody voted for him. Then they elect Carter, as I mentioned before, with the support pretty much of Southern Democrats. He says in an interview he's a born-again Christian, and all these Northerners have to go to their, I don't know what they did before the internet, but they had to go to the library and get, what is that? What is a born-again Christian? We don't know. But people in the South all knew. and they thought he was one of them, and so they voted him president. He unfortunately had like 4 very bad years: inflation, an oil crisis, and then this Iranian hostage thing. Okay, so 1980, it gets to be you get Reagan running for president, and Reagan opens up his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is close to where 3 civil rights workers, 2 white and 1 black, were killed earlier in the 60s. And it's sort of like, people talk about dog whistles. You know, a dog whistle is a whistle that only the dog can hear. And in politics, it means something that only your followers will get what you're talking about. And so starting your campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi is meant to be a dog whistle to Southern Democrats that they should vote for Reagan. And they do. So you have a period there where race relations are not great. It's really another period, okay? I want to fast forward quite a bit and get to the campaign of Obama for president, okay? Which was an amazing thing. He rose very quickly. Let's see, 2008 he gets elected. He gives a speech, I think, in 2004 at the Democratic Convention. The nominee is, I can't remember his name either. Kerry, John Kerry. The nominee is John Kerry, but Obama gives a speech in support of him. Obama is at this point in the Senate from Illinois. He's a Chicago guy at this point, although he's born in Hawaii, not Kenya. All right? People are looking at him. Blah, 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 blah. In 2008, he runs and gets the nomination and wins the election. I don't even know who he ran against. John McCain? He gets the, he ran against John McCain and what's her name? Sarah Palin. That was a weird one. And you know, in that election I voted for Hillary in the primary because I thought that people would be more willing to vote for a white woman than a black man. And sometimes that's how you have to figure things. I was wrong, okay? I'm not sure we'll ever have a woman president, but we have Kamala Harris, so who knows? But anyway, he gets elected president, and it was kind of like that's a turning point. But one of the things it did was it sort of opened the door for white people who had been sort of quiet to start making noise about, on racial lines, you know. There were a lot of cartoons, political cartoons, that featured particularly racist, watermelon, nooses, monkeys, all the fried chicken all the things that had been sort of like people weren't using those, I think I posted something in Facebook. I said, if what you're drawing, if what your cartoon indicates wouldn't make any sense if it was directed at a white person, then don't do it, You can criticize Obama all you want, in my eyes, but for what he does, not for who he is. Okay, it's not any good to like just go after him as a black person. Oh, the black president. Yeah. But that's what a lot of people did, and I think we get 12 years. He gets reelected. He must have done a good job, and then Trump rides the backlash into office. Okay, and that was a pretty scary thing. He basically said it was okay to be a Nazi in Charlottesville, and it's okay to hate immigrants and hate people that are the children of immigrants that happen to be born here and are American citizens. You can hate them too. It was pretty heavy stuff. And when I saw this, when I saw the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, I was really kind of shocked at how white the crowd was that was attacking the Capitol. That was not an Antifa, Black Lives Matter crowd. That was the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, those kinds of people. And I think it's really sad because I think one of America's strengths is in its diversity. Just the existence of black people in this country has kind of pushed it forward. I shudder to think where we would be without the movement for abolitionism and the movement for civil rights and union struggles and all that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit sad to me. All right. So I guess that's enough. I'm going to try and I'll upload this. And I think today is the 21st, which means we have 21 days, I think, 3 weeks. I may be cutting down the number of assignments because I have trouble grading them on time in a timely manner. I do like most of the work that I've seen. Some of you have not handed in anything, and that's going to be a problem for you. But I doubt you'll be watching this video if you're not handing in any work. There must be some problem there. I don't know how to get in touch with people like that. But those of you who are handing in stuff, I don't make a lot of remarks on things because it's difficult to do that in Blackboard. But I have been enjoying it. One thing you have to be careful of is the happy ending syndrome. Americans love a movie with a happy ending. There are movies that have one ending in Europe and a different ending here because Americans like a happy ending. But you have to be careful of that kind of thinking. The end of Reconstruction, 1877, was not a happy ending. Things didn't get better and better and better from there. They got worse and worse for black people, okay? All sorts of things like that. So you gotta kind of be beware of the like America's the greatest country in the world thing. It may be the greatest country in the world, but we do have problems. So remember that. The discussions have been going good. I like them. And we did 3 artifacts, and I'm expecting a second paper. And maybe 1 or 2 video summaries. But I'd like to do more videos before I assign those. All right? So stay in good health. I went out to the store last night, and I don't know, about 9 o'clock, I guess. And around the corner came like 8 or 9 BU students, none of whom were wearing masks. And I think they were loud, so, whatever that means. And I was thinking, like, it's taken me a while to get used to Thursday being the beginning of the weekend. But this was Tuesday night. Who goes out in a big crowd on Tuesday night getting loud? I don't know. But wear masks, all right? If not for yourself, for us old people. And relax. Don't be crazy, okay? And I'll see you tomorrow or the next day.